In a village outside the Italian city of Bologna, in the year 1894, a thin young man with a serious expression sent his brother out over a hill on the family estate and told him to wait there. His brother stationed him next to a crude metal box with a little hammer on it, a box his brother Guglielmo called a receiver. When he saw from his laboratory window that his brother was ready, Guglielmo went to his own apparatus, a sender, and carefully tapped out the 3 dots that represented the letter S in Morse code. Then, full of hope and apprehension, he looked out the window. A bright smile lit up his face at what he saw by the hillside. His brother was wildly waving the flag that was to indicate he had received the little message. The hammer on the receiving device had also tapped out 3 dots. Then Guglielmo had another idea. Suppose he moved his brother to the other side of the hill, where he couldn't even see him. Would the hill block the message, or would it still get through? Guglielmo handed his brother a pistol and sent him to the far side of the hill with the receiver. Now, when he looked from his laboratory window, he could see neither his brother nor the receiver, just the gentle green slopes of the Italian hillside and the empty blue sky above. Guglielmo took a deep breath, and then once again he tapped out 3 dots. Only a second later, the sound of a gunshot shattered the silence. The message had gone through. It was a moment of triumph for the 21-year-old Guglielmo Marconi. Not only had his radio waves traveled 3/4 of a mile, but the hill had represented no obstacle. Now he was more convinced than ever of what he'd always believed, that radio waves could be sent over any distance, and neither mountains nor oceans nor any other natural barrier would stop them. The wireless telegraph, or radio as we know it today, was about to revolutionize communications throughout the world. Guglielmo Marconi was not a typical inventor. Most famous inventors were born to middle-class or rural families and tinkered with their inventions in garages or backyard sheds. But Marconi was born in the upper class and was an aristocrat both by birth and by nature. He spent his early years working in his own laboratory on the family estate, with the financial backing of his father. He spent his later years working in his laboratory on an elegant private yacht. If necessity is truly the mother of invention, then Marconi is evidence that privilege may be the father of invention. He was born on April 25, 1874, in Bologna, but a few years later his family bought a manor on a large estate in the nearby village of Pentecchio. His father was a wealthy landowner whose first wife had died at the age of 38. His second wife, who was only 17, was the heiress of a whiskey manufacturing family in Ireland. It was she who was Guglielmo's mother. It's said that when Guglielmo was born, a neighbor rudely commented on his unusually large ears. Mrs. Marconi retorted, "That is so he can listen to things other people cannot hear." She may have been right. Marconi always claimed that radio was less of an idea to him and more of an intuition. An intuition, as he said, that these waves might, in a not-too-distant future, furnish mankind with a new and powerful means of communication. When Guglielmo was 5 years old, his mother took him to England to begin his formal schooling. The family noticed early on that he had an especially acute sense of hearing, particularly when it came to music and languages. By the time they returned to Italy, he was as fluent in English as in Italian. So fluent that after he became famous, the British were fond of saying that no matter what language he spoke, he sounded like one of them. Back on the family estate, Guglielmo's father noticed how quiet and shy his son was. Although his older brothers, Luigi and Alfonso, joined the neighborhood children in games and sports, Guglielmo preferred to go off on his own. Because of his reticence, his father decided not to subject him to routine schooling. Instead, he hired tutors and opened up the family library to the boy. Guglielmo spent many hours reading, fishing by himself, and lounging in the lower branches of trees, where he liked to think and dream about the subjects that interested him. Those subjects were mostly chemistry and electricity. Electricity fascinated him so much that by the time he was 12, He was connecting wires and playing with batteries in the attic that had been converted into his own personal laboratory. He was particularly interested in air and the chemicals it might hold. By age 13, he was trying to extract nitrate from the atmosphere. After his studies at home, Guglielmo spent 7 years at technical schools in the area. He tried for admittance to 2 different universities, but failed their entrance exams. However, a physics professor at the University of Bologna recognized Marconi's latent genius and allowed him to sit in on classes and conduct laboratory experiments. By now, Marconi knew exactly what he wanted to study. His ambition had started to materialize when he was only 14. He read about experiments with air waves that had been conducted by Heinrich Hertz. 20 years earlier, the existence of electromagnetic or radio waves had been demonstrated by a Scottish physicist named James Maxwell. He discovered these waves traveled with the speed of light, about 186,000 miles per second. He also discovered their behavior was similar to what happened when a stone is dropped into a pond. Waves ripple off in different directions from where the stone hit the water. Now, Hertz had been able to send these waves across a room with a device he called an oscillator without any connecting wires. Marconi was filled with questions and ideas when he read about Hertz. Could messages, music, and even speech be sent through the air? And if Hertz had sent his waves across a room, wasn't it possible to send them an even greater distance? A few miles, or across town, or even across the world? Samuel Morse, an American inventor, had long since created the telegraph, which sped messages across land by an electronic current running in wires, or across the ocean in cables sunk beneath the water. But if there were an instrument that could send electromagnetic or radio waves long distances, how much faster would it be? And there would be no need for the costly and inconvenient wires and cables. Marconi, still only an adolescent, had found his life's purpose. After he read the book about Hertz, Marconi spent his whole summer filling up notebooks with diagrams and figures. They were rough, unartistic drawings, but they held the seeds of an innovative system by which antennas could send and receive signals, and a device could convert the signals into sounds or words. When he returned from his summer vacation, he retreated to his laboratory in the villa to begin work on transforming the pictures into reality. There were other scientists working on radio waves when Marconi began his work, scientists far older and more experienced. Marconi was not the least bit intimidated. In fact, he used many of their developments in his own work, borrowing ideas, modifying them, and adding to them, as inventors had done for centuries. He rose early and worked all day and into the night, growing even thinner and more pale than he was before. His mother began to get concerned. Her son had never been robust to start with. In his appearance, he took after her Irish side of the family. He had blue eyes and fair hair, a light complexion, and the thin, equine features of the nobility. Now his blue eyes were dim with fatigue, and his face was drawn and haggard. Finally, after weeks of toying with coils, tubes, rods, and terminals, he announced that he was ready for his first demonstration. Marconi invited his family upstairs. Then, when they were all gathered together, he pushed a button on his sending apparatus on the 3rd floor, and down in the basement a bell rang. His brothers and his mother were astounded. His father, who had been paying for all this equipment, was unimpressed. He grumbled that unless Marconi could find a way to send signals further than the 1st floor of his own house, there wasn't going to be much future in these devices, except perhaps as parlor tricks. Nevertheless, Mr. Marconi continued to finance his son and to hope his experiments would lead to something big. In this laboratory upstairs, secluded from the world, Marconi worked on. There were many setbacks and failures, but soon he had a few achievements too. He was able to put more power into the waves, to concentrate them into beams and give them greater drive. After a while, the reception became clearer and sharper. It was then that he sent his brother out to the hills and discovered he could send a message as far as almost a mile. When he invited his father to come and witness this success, At last Mr. Marconi was satisfied. Always a businessman, he could now see that his son's work had tremendous commercial potential. He encouraged him to continue. Marconi also knew he was on the verge of a breakthrough, and he did continue. Soon he was sending messages from the villa for over a mile, then 2 miles. Still, it wasn't good enough. If his invention was going to have any practical use, it would have to work for far longer distances than 2 miles. He would need a more sophisticated laboratory and more and better equipment, more than his father could afford. With the help of influential friends, Marconi tried to persuade the Italian government to finance his efforts, but it refused. The government found his invention entertaining and clever, but saw no serious use for it. It would be the same reaction Alexander Graham Bell would get in America when he first unveiled his telephone. Undeterred by the lack of appreciation in his own homeland, Marconi set out for England at the invitation of a cousin who offered to help him. Perhaps, thought Marconi, the British would be more visionary than the Italians. He was 22 years old when he arrived in England, and he set out right away to demonstrate his invention to the people who would be most interested. He took it to the General Post Office, the War Office, and the Telegraph Department. He also took out the first patent ever issued for what was called wireless telegraphy. Marconi's demonstrations were astounding. The government engineers who gathered to see them were full of praise and admiration, but no one offered him money. Refusing to be thwarted, Marconi, with the help of his cousin, simply bypassed the government and began to raise his own funds, mostly from friends. Together they established the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company in London. Then they set up a factory in the English countryside and began to manufacture all the equipment and devices necessary for wireless telegraphy. When he used his new equipment to flash a signal 10 miles across the Bristol Channel, suddenly his old homeland was interested in him. Italy invited Marconi to set up a station on the Italian Riviera and to contact warships that were 12 miles at sea. He did as he was asked. Soon the Italian Navy was using his devices regularly to transmit messages between the coast and its ships at sea. His first official business deal was successfully completed, and Marconi returned to England to resume his work. Back in England again, Marconi began to set up station after station, steadily increasing the strength and distance of his messages. On the Isle of Wight, he built a 120-foot mast supporting an antenna made of wire netting. He also installed equipment on 2 steamers cruising the nearby waters. Soon there were regular messages passing back and forth between the ships and the island, a distance of over 18 miles. In 1899, when he was 25, Marconi took on the English Channel. He built a wireless station on England's cliffs of Dover and another one on the coast of France. When messages were successfully sent between these 2 stations and across one of the world's most famous waterways, a distance of 32 miles, the press went wild. Reporters began to write what Marconi had been saying since he was a child. Wireless was going to change the world. Wireless was going to usher in a new era of communications, both in business and private use. Scientists, too, were certain that the young inventor from Italy had achieved a major step in scientific progress. As for the public, it became convinced of the value of the wireless in 1898 when a ship was rammed by a steamer. The ship happened to have a wireless aboard, which it used to signal a lighthouse that it was in trouble. Lifeboats were sent, and the whole crew of the wrecked vessel was saved. Now Marconi was more than a genius, he was a hero. His heroism increased in 1909 when the ocean liner the Republic sank, and again in 1912 when the Titanic sank. Both times the wireless enabled ships to rescue hundreds of stranded passengers. The young hero still had many problems to work out, however, and felt he had only made a beginning. For one thing, as his messages traveled through the air, they could be picked up by any antenna. This limited its use, particularly for the government, which usually wanted its messages kept secret. Within only a matter of weeks, Marconi had solved the problem with the first system of selective tuning, which he called syntony. With this method, an antenna could be set to receive signals traveling only on a particular wavelength, or as he put it, when the receiver and transmitter are attuned. In this same year of 1899, when he was still only 25, Marconi made his first trip to America. Journalists followed him everywhere, and one reporter offered this description of him: "He's no bigger than a Frenchman, and no older than a quarter of a century. He is a mere boy, with a boy's happy enthusiasm and a man's view of his life's work. His manner is a little nervous and his eyes a bit dreamy. He acts with the modesty of a man who merely shrugs his shoulders when accused of discovering a new continent." Even though he was now famous, Marconi remained as serious and shy as he'd always been. He never behaved as if he thought he was a genius, and in fact, when asked to describe his invention for the layperson, he willingly gave a very straightforward explanation. He said, "Everyone knows how sound is transmitted by vibrations in air. For instance, if you fire a cannon, the concussion produced by the explosion causes the air to vibrate, and so far as these vibrations extend, just so far is sound audible. Well, my vertical wire carries the electric vibrations up into the air and produces certain vibrations in the atmosphere. These vibrations extend in every direction and continue until they reach a receiving instrument. Thus, a message can be transmitted through the air for as great a distance as you can cause vibration to proceed." It was that simple to Marconi, and it always had been. While in the United States, Marconi installed a transmitter on the coast of New Jersey, which he used to file reports to 2 newspapers about America's Cup yacht races. Watching these proceedings was the American inventor Thomas Alva Edison, who not so modestly commented, "This fellow's work puts him in my class. It's a good thing we caught him young." The American Navy was equally impressed. It purchased his wireless devices to use on its ships. When he returned to England, Marconi shifted his focus to his biggest dream, devising a wireless that could send signals across the Atlantic Ocean. Before he died, his work would take him back and forth across the Atlantic 89 times. At the beginning of this project, he was besieged by other scientists who told him it was impossible. Electromagnetic waves, they insisted, traveled in a straight line and didn't follow the curves of the Earth. On reaching the horizon, they would simply veer off into space. So, whereas they might be useful someday in communications with other planets, they would never be useful in communications between America and Europe. They were wrong, and Marconi knew it. He forged ahead with what he called the big thing. The first step was to build a transmitter on the southernmost tip of England. It was the most powerful transmitter to date, 100 times more powerful than any he'd previously constructed. It was made of a circle of antenna-bearing masts, each of them 200 feet high. And whereas his earlier transmitters had been powered by batteries, this one had its own power plant, driven by a 32-horsepower engine. But although Marconi had overcome many obstacles to get where he was that day, financing, government support, and the pessimism of other scientists, now he ran into a new opponent, nature. In January of 1891, he tested the power of the beams from his new transmitter. That done, he dashed over to America again and built a similar setup on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Those watching were amused by his efforts. Never, they said, could a signal travel the 3,000 miles from England to the United States. 6 months later, a cyclone-like storm, described by the British as the worst in living memory, hit the coast of England and destroyed the huge masts he'd built. Every single one of them had to be rebuilt. Then another storm hit the northern coast of America, razing to the ground every mast he'd built there. It was a good opportunity for the cynics. They repeated again that the scheme would never work and was doomed to failure. But Marconi was an inventor in mind and spirit, and inventors don't give up. First, he revised the system in England so it was less elaborate and less fragile. Then he found a new site for the American station, farther north at St. John's in Newfoundland. the point on the American coast where the Atlantic is narrowest and the weather less ferocious. The equipment was lugged up to the top of a 600-foot hill that overlooked St. John's Harbor. But nature still seemed to be challenging Marconi's commitment. The weather was continually bad and trial balloons were ripped away. To make matters worse, Marconi couldn't get his structure up to the required height. Finally, to solve the problem, he raised the aerial to 400 feet by using kites to hold up the antenna. When it was all done, Marconi took a seat in the tower and waited for the signal from England. They were to use his old favorite message from his first experiments, 3 dots that make up the Morse code for the letter S. Their instructions were to send the message at regular intervals for 8 hours and to continue daily until told to stop. Marconi took turns listening with his longtime assistant, George Kemp, trading back and forth the one set of headphones they shared. The first day was a disappointment. They heard nothing but static, and periodically one of their floating balloons broke away in the wind and had to be replaced. The next day started out much the same way. Lots of static and an occasional problem with the balloons. Then, at 12:30 p.m., Marconi thought he heard something. Just the faintest signal. He handed the headphones to his assistant, asking, "Can you hear anything, Kemp?" Mr. Kemp did hear something. Emerging through the static and noise was the unmistakable click, click, click of the letter S, followed by a pause. Marconi had bridged the Atlantic Ocean with radio waves. When the world learned that Marconi had achieved his miraculous goal, he was celebrated as the man of the hour, the epoch-making Marconi, and the master of space. Some scientists then and even today doubt that he really did hear the S. So difficult were the conditions under which he worked. But the question isn't very important, because less than a year later he received another signal from England to Canada, and this time the message was recorded on a printing device. The following year, in 1902, Marconi established the Radio Corporation of America in New York City. Today it's known simply as RCA. Within 6 years of its start, transatlantic wireless service was well underway, as was the development of radio broadcasting, an outgrowth of the wireless. Now that the groundwork had been laid, Marconi could relax a little and think about the personal side of his life. In 1905, when he was 31, he married the Honorable Beatrice O'Brien, the daughter of an Irish lord. The Marconis had 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, but the marriage itself ended in divorce after 19 years. After his triumph in Canada, Marconi's name was a household word, and awards and recognition came from every corner of the globe. But he wasn't content to sit back and make acceptance speeches and give interviews to the press. Instead, he went back to work, broadening the scope of his inventions. Shortly after he set up RCA, he patented the magnetic detector. Then he followed that with the horizontal directional aerial. He launched a study of ultra-short waves, 15 meters as compared with the 2,000 meters he was used to working with, and proved that they could be aimed at any part of the world and would carry clear, undistorted messages. The system he created helped make shortwave radio an efficient and reliable means of communication. Meanwhile, others took up his work and made new advances in communications. John Fleming applied the thermionic valve to Marconi's work, which led to Lee de Forest's vacuum tube, which in turn led to radio and talking pictures. As always in the field of invention, each idea inspired others in a continuing spiral upward and forward. Marconi himself had said, "There are no limits in science. Each advance merely widens the sphere of exploration." When he was 35, Marconi received 2 prominent awards. He was made a member of the Italian Senate, and he received the Nobel Prize for Physics. In 1919, at the end of World War I, he was chosen to represent Italy at the signing of peace treaties with Austria and Bulgaria, and was made a delegate to the Paris Peace Conference. This active participation in restoring peace to the world must have pleased him, for Marconi had suffered deeply during the war. He had always believed that his invention was a benevolent gift for humanity, and that by providing better communication, it would promote peace and understanding. Like Einstein and like the Wright brothers, he was horrified to see his invention used for the purpose of destruction. In a speech he made in Scotland during the war, he asked plaintively, "Have I done the world good, or have I added a menace?" Disillusioned by the war, but apparently still hopeful about marriage, Marconi made one more try at it in 1929, when he was 53 years old. This time it worked. He chose yet another aristocratic beauty, Countess Maria Cristina Betsy Scali, whose Italian roots went back to the old papal aristocracy. A prince officiated at the civil wedding ceremony, and a cardinal performed the religious rites. Marconi and his wife had one daughter, whom he fittingly called Elettra. Never giving up his work, Marconi nevertheless settled into a life of luxury. He purchased a 220-foot ocean-going yacht in which he installed a small but state-of-the-art laboratory. The yacht, too, he named Elettra. The Elettra was his main home until the day he died. Then, in 1929, Marconi was given his own title. He was made an Italian Marquis. Through the second half of his life, Marconi lived and was treated more as a noble than a scientist. He was a mystery in some ways, a man of many contradictory qualities. He could exhibit much sensitivity and thoughtfulness, as in his anxiety over World War I. He was a very creative person, as one would expect, but he was also an astute businessman, not a common trait in inventors. Marconi was amiable with reporters, no matter how they hounded him, and yet he also had the superiority and aloofness typical of an aristocrat. At his offices in London, he would refuse to ride an elevator if it held employees he didn't personally know. It's possible that this aloofness, for which he was well known, was an extension of the severe shyness he had as a child. But of course, shyness doesn't explain the yacht and the titled women he chose to marry. In the long run, it seems as if Marconi had a very genuine interest in contributing to science and progress, felt justified in being rewarded for those contributions, was pleased to serve humanity, but preferred to remain removed from those he served. From his private laboratory on the yacht Elettra, Marconi worked on further extensions of the wireless into his 60s. A series of small heart attacks interfered with his work from time to time, and his wife pleaded with him each time to take an extended rest. But as soon as he was half recovered, he was back in the lab with his studies and experiments. Then, when he was working one afternoon at his home in Rome, he collapsed from overwork. Not knowing what was wrong, he said simply, "I'm very, very tired." Oxygen was administered, but it was too late. The final heart attack had occurred on July 19, 1937, and he died the next morning, July 20th, at the age of 63. News of his death was sent via radio waves throughout the world. On the day of his funeral, radio stations throughout the world observed a 2-minute silence in tribute. The work of Guglielmo Marconi had fostered a major industry and profoundly influenced American society. Once he had proven the potential of radio waves, the uses and expansions of those waves occurred in rapid succession. Although he himself primarily invented the wireless telegraph, it was the invention that followed from this work, the radio, that left such a great impression on the world. In 1920, there were 5,000 radios in America, mostly in the hands of experimenters and technicians. 4 years later, there were 2,500,000 radios, mostly in private homes. For decades, there was a new innovation in radio almost every year. In 1922, it was the first time an American president was heard over the airwaves, Herbert Hoover, dedicating the Francis Scott Key Memorial in Baltimore. It was also the year of the first play-by-play coverage of the World Series. In 1937, there was the first coast-to-coast radio program, a report on the Hindenburg disaster. The same year was the first worldwide radio broadcast received in the United States, the coronation of King George VI of England. In those first 20 years were all the great moments of radio that would be remembered for generations. The Jack Benny Show, Fibber McGee and Molly, Burns and Allen, The Shadow, Orson Welles' terrifying broadcast of War of the Worlds, the fireside chats of Franklin Roosevelt, the Hit Parade, and many, many more. All brought to the public by famous sponsors like Jell-O and Lux Soap, and by the genius and determination of Guglielmo Marconi. The power of radio to entertain and inform was unlike anything that had preceded it. Even television, which many thought marked the end of radio, couldn't replace its special role in communications. Its ability to reach us almost anywhere, its use in emergency situations on land and at sea, and its ability to evoke the imagination. Marconi didn't live to see the newest age of radio, the space age, but he knew it was coming. He wouldn't have been the least surprised in 1959 when the first radio waves were bounced off the moon. In many ways, Marconi was an inventor who simply planted the seeds. The greatest fruits of his labors came later and are even today still being harvested. But it was he who laid the groundwork, and that, perhaps, is the greatest service of any inventor, to make the discoveries that pave the way for the discoveries of the future.